Hey, good afternoon, young people. Continuing our discussion from Monday's class, talking about the different challenges that male and female inmates face when they enter into the prison system. One of the major challenges we left off talking about the other day, unfortunately, is being a victim of sexual assault. This is true of both male and female prisoners. And quite frankly, it's something that when you're a new inmate on trial, you're a new inmate, I'm sorry, you're almost on trial amongst the other inmates. This is especially true for juveniles and minor offenders. Unfortunately, it's rare that we imprison juveniles in adult prisons, but unfortunately, there have been some times where there's happened. Generally, when a juvenile is charged with murder, and in a situation like that, they're very much in a vulnerable state for sexual assault. This is also true of like non-violent criminals. But overall, it's one of the things is considering again, it's the true for men and women, is that you're going to have to probably be able to be required to defend yourself physically. The laws have gotten better where people have more protections from this kind of thing than I think they may have a couple of decades ago, but still not at the levels. The guards are not going to be able to monitor things 24 hours a day. So oftentimes, again, there's a requirement to show some physical resistance to this behavior. And oftentimes, if you do, you'll get left alone. You'll be tested to see if you're a quote unquote punk, if you will. And if you're able to defend yourself, a lot of times people will kind of back up off you. If not, oftentimes that may dictate the way that you're treated throughout your stay. And again, when we look at the victims, white inmates, again, there are not many places where, you have an advantage being a minority, but dealing with some of the violent conditions of prisons might be one. And even then, the benefits can be limited only to physical activities. But nearly 60% in one study was found that white inmates were attacked more than any other race. A lot of times, where you have like white Aryan gangs or things like that, because again, we talked about last time the security threat groups, where many times individuals will feel compelled to kind of join the gang because being aligned with a coalition with a group of people can give you better protections against things like this. So sometimes, whites, if there's like an Aryan Nazi gang or something like that, they may not always enter into the prison, holding those beliefs, but they're going to need to, unify with somebody oftentimes to give them some protections against these kind of assaults. Generally, they're picking upon younger victims, inmates, unfortunately, with mental illness or intellectual impairment are more likely to be victimized. And one of the things, again, that, we will talk about, throughout, particularly later in the class, is the design of the prisons themselves. So the prison designs can either limit or facilitate rises and decreases in sexual assault. Some other factors for individual prison violence will be a history of prior violence. Sometimes this can be, again, if you're a violent criminal, you have a violent reputation, that there may be an expectation that you exhibit that within this institution. Psychological factors, recall last time that we talked about a large proportion of inmates have some type of mental health issues. And sometimes this can trigger some violent and disruptive behavior. But the prison conditions themselves can also provoke violence. We'll talk about this going forward as well. Some of the at times there have been prison riots, And it's been over the conditions of the prisons, cells being too cold in the winter, too hot in the summer, food quality not being where it needs to be, certain rights that prisoners are able to have are not being adhered to. So again, even though we oftentimes treat these people like they're disposable, and that we want to make things as difficult for them as possible. We talked about the pains of imprisonment on Monday. That there's some balances between that, where if you make the conditions so poor, the prisoners have all types of ways to make things difficult for the people that work there. So we talked about in the beginning, there's a symbiotic relationship, a two-way relationship between the prisoners and the guards. So just try, keep the environment as peaceful and stable as possible. It's not a fun environment for anyone. So they want to try and keep things, as manageable as possible for both. So inmate balance theory, administrative control theory, and overcrowding are some of the main factors that explain collective violence. Again, not individual violence where one inmate attacks another because of something that may have happened when they were both out on the street. Individual gang retaliations or something of that nature. These are related to the balance in terms of the number of guards compared to the rate of the number of prisoners, which is related to the final bullet point of overcrowding. But again, in any environment, in any setting, that having too many people up on top of each other is going to cause some levels of consternation and tension. So you recall you had to write about in the first half of the class, your papers really spoke to the rampant overcrowding of the prisons in the 1980s and early 1990s that came from, again, locking people up, for minor offenses, 25 to life statutes and things of that nature. But through that overcrowding, it made it a lot more difficult for prison administrators to actually have control over the facilities. So again, it's a lot of things at work here that we have to consider a lot of times, where politicians that go on TV and they'll just say, hey, let's lock everybody up. That's the solution. But there are all types of residual effects of that decision that we always want to consider in a state prison system. We talked about on Monday that the highest rates of inmates is coming from amongst Black women. Before 1960, this was very rare. There were very few women that were in prison. As we talked about in the first half of the class, the war on drugs ensnared a lot of people within the prison system that probably would not have been in previous generations. Because again, the crack epidemic, it was really buck wild, no question about it. But it wasn't the first drug epidemic the country's ever seen or seen since. Again, we have been in the midst of a heroin and opioid pandemic for the last couple of decades now. And the government hasn't responded by, locking a whole bunch of white people up. Those are the primary users and distributors of those drugs. But through the war on drugs, a lot of people of color and a lot of women have been in prison as well. So yeah, most of it has actually not been related to violence and things of that nature. It's mainly been drug possession and things like that, where women oftentimes, much like we talked about, where many people in an effort to boost themselves economically in the Reagan 80s, they would turn to crack dealing, and if you either sell or possess drugs, you're going to go to prison. And many women got involved in the drug trade as well. It wasn't just like a male thing. But also, one important thing to keep in mind, in terms of with the war on drugs, how do you think, a lot of arrests or how do you think a lot of convictions are gained through the war on drugs? what is the method that the police use to gain a lot of convictions for the war on drugs? What do you all think? What's the method for that? What do the police do to get a conviction? Not an arrest, but a conviction. They mainly get people to snitch on each other. And if you don't snitch, like, so sometimes, if you, I've known individuals that this has happened to, where you may get arrested for something. It's like, okay, Savannah, tell us what you know, but I don't know nothing. Well, you better tell us something or else. So Savannah, like, okay, fine. Like, Latasia gave me the crack. Shit, I don't know. And I'm exaggerating, but many arrests have been made just like that. So a lot of times what happens is, Savannah, your boyfriend may have been selling drugs. You might not have had anything to do with it at all. May not even be aware of it. But they arrest him and they use you to put pressure on him. So they'll come in, like, bust down the house. Again, Breonna Taylor was killed this way. They weren't really, coming there for Breonna. Now, her dude actually hadn't done anything, but the investigation, like many other police investigations, they're trying to, put pressure on a drug dealer who oftentimes is the male, but you're staying in a house with your woman and your kids. We locking everybody up. So a great deal, many women have gotten entangled in this process as well. It's not as much about, violent crime. Again, oftentimes, in spite of the probably literally hundreds of times I've tried to communicate this now in this class alone and others, I'll try one more time. When we think of crime, we often think of violence, people being assaulted, things like what happened in Colorado the other day, things that like happened in Atlanta last week. That's not what most people are in prison for in America. That is not what most people are in prison for in America. The overwhelming majority of people in prison in America are for drug crimes. Most of those people are not drug dealers. They're drug users. So, you're locking up a bunch of female crackheads and things like that, people that might, be, associated with drug dealers. You do have more women committing violent crimes. That's true. But that's not what most of these arrests are focused on. It is really important that we understand that factually. Now, again, you may not believe me, and I don't want you to believe me. I want you to do your own research on this. But it's really important that we kind of as we go and work in the criminal justice system, that we have this firm understanding, because a lot of times we think, we approach this like it's the wild, wild west, and it's not quite that. So there were not many institutions that were built for women between 1930 and 50, but since the 1980s, like I said, the war on drugs, the war on drugs, the war on drugs, the war on drugs, which many have interpreted to be a war on Black people, and why would they say such a thing? Because as I said, there have been many times where there's been drug epidemics, including now, and the government has not responded to that by locking people up. Again, you can do your own research on this. I and probably 10 million other criminal justice scholars could be making that up. So again, white women that are, abusing heroin and opioids and things like that, they're not being taken to prison. And from my view, I don't believe they should be. Not drug users. I'm not sure what that helps. And the research is pretty thick that shows that doesn't really help people get off of drugs. Now, we want to punish people because, they did things we don't like. That's a different discussion, but we always want to keep in mind, what is the purpose of punishment? Particularly, right? And look, we're not presenting data here for people to have just, sympathy for criminals, or feel like people should not, do their penance if they commit a crime. We talked about, the awful levels of mental health challenges in this country that oftentimes go unaddressed. But having a mental health issue or having something in your personal background that might be troubling does not excuse you to commit crimes. So again, the dude in Colorado the other day, by all accounts, he had some mental health issues. They took him to a hospital, ran some tests, made sure he got his proper medications, and then they took him to prison. Like, he's not in a mental health facility this morning. He is in prison. That's probably where he'll spend most of his life. Well, he killed 10 people. Yeah, so he's going to die in prison. And he killed white people, so yeah, they'll probably convict him. But the background of inmates is really important to consider because, in the social sciences, we pay a lot of attention to like the environment and the role that it plays on human behavior. So just because you grew up in a troubled home, that don't excuse you from committing crimes. You still may have to be responsible and accountable before the law. Understood. The same way rich people should be accountable for the law if they commit a crime. But when we see patterns like this, we really should, I would hope that we would ask ourselves some questions as a society about, again, what are we really doing? As we look again, so look, right? We just talked about before that we're locking up more and more young women who oftentimes have children and will be the primary the sole providers for some of their families sometimes. But a lot of these women, Savannah, are kind of set up and put in conditions where it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to really succeed. So like, I know some of you all want to go into social work, for example, right? And some of you may want to go into psychology. This is really important work because the hope will be, Latasia, that with some of these young girls, you can reach them. And because again, they don't have criminal problems a lot of times. They got mental health problems. That's true of so many people in the criminal justice system. So if we can maybe help improve their mental health before they commit crimes, that will save a lot of troubled young lives. And quite frankly, it would save us as an economy a whole bunch of money. It is cheaper to get them mental health assistance when they're young and to be locking them up for 10, 20 years when they're old. Like it's really basic, but we don't take these things seriously as a country. And that's why it's really important we really critically analyze some of this information and we don't just repeat some of the things that, people have said about criminal justice and criminals for generations. Like, we really need to speak from a factual place. And the facts show that an overwhelming large proportion of these women come from troubled families. Many, again, were, reared in poverty. They received welfare sometime during their adult lives. Very many of these young girls were abused, both physically and sexually, oftentimes in situations where they couldn't tell anybody because a large proportion of sexual assaults come from other family members. Oftentimes they were sent through schools that weren't really attempting to educate them, but just, send them along and not really give them any kind of skills that's going to allow them to compete in this new economy. Related to their poverty, many suffer from poor physical health. So again, if we can prevent a lot of these problems, and I, Dr. Muhammad, believe that a lot of these problems are preventable, that we have enough resources in this society where we can help people like this before it gets to a criminal stage. Oftentimes we make political choices not to. Women, again, though, they do find ways. Again, all these things have been researched. As always, I would encourage you to do your own. That women find ways, much like, again, we talked about with the dudes in the gangs, that they'll form coalitions and, affiliate themselves with gangs to, for protection and just to get through it. It's difficult socially to try and get through something like that by yourself. So sometimes this will come in the form of homosexual alliances, and sometimes even fictive prison families, where this homosexual couple may be the parents, this younger prison might be like the daughter. So they have kind of a family structure, a fictional family structure, But again, this is all due, like, human beings are adaptive. As social science majors, if you've learned nothing else, I hope that you'll, understand this, that human beings are constantly, like, working and laboring to adapt, just to try and, survive their environments. So this happens in prison amongst women as well. As I talked about, a great deal of these women who go into prison are mothers, nearly 60%. So keep in mind, right? Like, if we need to, I think we can all agree. Somebody that, like the dude in Colorado, that obviously is not safe. We want to keep him away from human beings. I really hope to God that some of these reports about Deshaun Watson, the quarterback for the Houston Texans, I really hope that this turns out not to be true. But it's a lot of smoke there so far. And if it is true, people like that have to be kept away from society. But he's been accused of multiple counts of sexual assault. We have to protect the public from people like that. But we want to, again, we really want to look closely at what are we accomplishing by, having so many women kept away from their children in this way. Again, violent, deadly criminals that are threats to, like, society and threats to the public order. But as we saw here with some of this data here before, the main crime that a lot of these women are guilty of is being, like, a threat to themselves. Substance abuse and things of that nature, and habits and behaviors that come with substance abuse or mental health issues. We got nearly 150,000 children under 18 that are experiencing being without their mother, their most important caregiver in most families. We got 150,000 children under 18 without their mother. And we already know, we're probably familiar with the data on incarcerated fathers. What do we predict? What do we think is going to happen to these children? They going to stay on the straight and narrow? And oftentimes that's the case. The research has shown again and again and again that the more likely, you're more likely to commit or get incarcerated yourself if you have family members that have been incarcerated. That's not just for Black people, that's white cats, everybody. So it's really hard to break this cycle once it gets started. There are some prison nurseries that allow them to keep their newborn children with them behind bars. But that's only for a limited time. And again, like, it's important to understand there are some women who get arrested while they're pregnant, who have to deliver their babies in prison. There are 8 states that now offer prison nurseries. In those 42 other states, as soon as you give birth, I want to take the shorty and we got to put you back in this cage. Almost always, if you give birth, it's going to be done with the woman chained to the bed, handcuffed to the bed. Again, if this is somebody that's really violent and threatening, I think we can all rationalize ourselves around that. But we really want to explore the extent that, somebody having like a bag of weed justifies all of that. A bag of weed that, depending on where you at in this country, you're not actually breaking the law. One of the things we talked about in the first half in terms of considering the high rate of prison costs is the healthcare. Again, we have to, like, once these people are locked up, you and I, the taxpayer, are responsible for their healthcare. And women on average are going to have more health issues as they get older than men will. A big concern, and this is something for you all to consider, for your future career choices is that since like the rising female prison population is kind of a new thing, and there weren't sufficient facilities built to like really support them. A lot of these facilities don't really have adequate personnel and resources to really assist women in the way that they should. This may be an opportunity for some of you all to provide those services for them as you get into your careers or start your own business. This is particularly true as it relates to reproductive health care. There's also lack of proper treatment for substance abuse. And again, for my psychology or my human service majors out there, you definitely want to pay keen attention to the dearth of mental health services that are in prison. We're locking somebody up, they're bipolar, they're schizophrenic. Those conditions still continue on whether they're in prison or not. By those conditions not being taken care of, it puts everybody in the prison at more risk. So we need to do a better job of providing those services for people, but in many states, there's just not an appetite to do so because, again, that costs money. So a lot of times the charge be just put them in these walls and figure the rest out later on. And that may sound good, but it's a lot of bad money thrown away. A huge challenge with this, and we talked about this a little bit on Monday about how contraband gets into prisons. And a lot of times it's not a huge challenge to bribe these officers because typically they made very little money. There are steps being made to change this, though. However, that I might encourage you to look at. The salaries are improving. Now, again, I think that there are probably other areas of criminal justice that will pay higher, that may expose you to less of a physical risk. But these can be good, productive, entry-level positions. The standards in the prisons overall are improving. And again, one of the main goals here is just to keep everybody safe. The training that these corrections officers are getting is a lot more advanced. Historically, a lot of times to be a correctional officer, like the famous gangster rapper Rick Ross used to be back in the day. True story. Another fun fact, if you've seen Come to America, 2. I know everybody's seen Come to America 1. That was Rick Ross' crib that they were filming in Laetitia. It's pretty impressive. They wanted to film in my crib, but I'm like, look, I'm teaching remotely this semester. I can't be having y'all coming up in here, man, having elephants and stuff in my backyard. So y'all got to find somewhere else. And he's like, dang. Well, but in all seriousness, like more and more of these correctional officers, like, one of the things that you want to pay keen attention to is they're getting more education. A lot of times you just have to be big and physically tough and just be able to throw people around. But now, increasingly, Nigeria, you got to be able to use your mind. It ain't just about being tough and, hey, get over here, do this. Like, you got to, understand human development. You have to be able to diagnose if somebody's having mental health issues. Like, you need to understand chemical reactions in the brain and things of that nature. So more and more, like, they got to get like better training, and better training workers is going to make everybody a lot more safe. It's funny. They're making, again, the wages. Money is a driver of all types of things. You all have heard the saying, you get what you pay for. And a lot of times, if you ain't paying people a lot of money to do really dangerous and challenging work, I'm sorry, like, under COVID and stuff, that we aren't able to do this. As I said, most of the times when I taught this class, we actually go to a prison and people can kind of see some of these things themselves and kind of like, get a direct contact in terms of like how individuals how individuals navigate that who work there, and different opportunities for investment. But the wages historically have not been very good. They're starting to improve that a little bit. And the FBI is even requiring 3 years of college for the correctional officers in their facilities. Again, most prisoners are in prison in state facilities, but if you want to work in an FBI facility, and again, this is something I would encourage you all to look through. Yeah, I got 3 years of college. So please make sure that, as you start to work towards graduation, that you really look into the job market pretty thoroughly and see all the opportunities that are available for you. Because education is becoming much more valuable in criminal justice than it was before. And it's going to give you a huge advantage over a lot of your competitors in the job market. Nigeria, more unionization, great question. So in a union, Nigeria, it makes it a lot more difficult for you to get fired, and it makes it easier for you to have collective rights. So I'm sure that most of you all have had jobs before, right? If you working at, if you're working at Kirkland Correctional Facility and you say like, look, the hours are too long, like the security systems are poor, the air quality here is bad, like y'all need to get, and the pay is too low, like y'all need to get this straightened out. If it's just you coming in there as an individual worker in Nigeria, they can be like, okay, well, look, if you don't like it, too bad, you can leave. But if it's a group of workers that's making this complaint, it's a lot more difficult to replace everybody. So that's what you have with a union. It's a collective. With a union, you have collective bargaining rights, as opposed to just an individual worker trying to lobby for better conditions. So good question. So more and more, so corrections officers, for the most part, they weren't part of unions. And look, this is an important consideration for your job fields, that being part of a union, there can be some pros and cons to them, but there's a lot of worker protections when you're part of a union that just are not in place when you're not. South Carolina generally does not have unions, as it's a right to work state. So as you get into your career, those are the kind of things that you definitely want to listen to, look out for. It's a great question. You also want to be aware of the subculture amongst the guards. So much like I'm sure you've heard of like the thick blue line of police officers that, they stick together. That's how, unfortunately, a lot of times when we get these, I would like to believe, matter of fact, I do believe that the vast majority of police officers are not road cops, that they go about doing their jobs effectively in the way that it has been outlined in the Constitution. The problem is that when you have bad cops, the other good cops cover for them. That's part of their subculture. And every profession has its own subculture. So if you do become a prison guard, you absolutely want to make sure that you're aware of their subculture as well. It varies from state to state and prison to prison. And as we talked about, they got a lot more education than they did back in the day. And that's helpful. So again, when you have education, and you're not just, okay, this person did something bad. Education speaks to being able to being aware of data like this. This doesn't mean that, again, you go soft on everybody, but it's really important to understand the social factors that have affected the people before you that you deal with every day. So having more education, understanding how mental health issues work and some mental health triggers, those things will make you a more effective guard today. We also, again, have more women enter the ranks. As I said, it's no longer just about physical strength in terms of being able to wrestle some prisoner and throw them down. If you're doing your job effectively, Latasia, you should not have to do that very often. The same way, again, like as a parent, right? If you got to be beating your child all the time, then it's probably something a little bit off with your parenting skills. Now, you may have to, break that rod out sometimes. But for the most part, we should be able to have a communication for you to understand what I need you to do. And we should be able to, again, deal with this in an intelligent manner. If you're using force all the time, your prison is going to be very disruptive. Let's look very closely at the professionalism of prison staff, women staff, and then we'll take a break in a moment. Are there any questions so far? So again, some of the things that again that women have brought to the table here has been a greater desire to treat inmates with dignity and respect. Again, it's clear. You're the guard, you're the correctional officer, they're the prisoner. You have weaponry and all types of other technology at your disposal. You are in charge. You don't have to consistently demean people or abuse them to show that you're in charge. So you can treat them with respect. Again, respect has to go both ways. You can't allow yourself to be disrespected as a staff member, but you don't have to, again, treat them abusively. You want to try and, again, provide a safe environment for both the inmates and the staff. You can't, again, that's the most important consideration. The inmates cannot run the asylum. You also understand that staff training is a necessary aspect of a humane prison. Again, a humane prison. This is very different from how prisons have been run historically, where it's just about, brute force and control. Again, that's not necessary. If you have children and you have to be using force and demeaning tactics all the time, then we have to ask some questions about your level of effectiveness. And increasingly, again, when we talk about accreditation, that the environment of prisons is monitored a lot more closely than it was back in the 1950s, 60s, and before. There's a lot more attention to what goes on in there to make sure that prisoners' rights are being adhered to. And there are accreditation bodies where if you don't meet certain standards, you can lose your accreditation and the prison can be shut down. If there are no further questions, we'll leave it here for now. We're going to talk about the juvenile offender on Monday. And this is an important chapter for you all to focus on. And please at least read some of this before Monday. And keep in mind some of the things we talked about, how a person's background has a huge impact upon how they matriculate through the criminal justice system. There's a wide body of research that shows a correlation between you being institutionalized as a juvenile and being in that cycle as an adult. So please look close at that chapter. We'll do this again on Monday at 2:00. Please note assignment 2 is now open, or on e-learning. Assignment 2 is now open. So start on that as soon as possible. And make note that